Okay, so today we're continuing to talk about World War II. This is part three. We're going to focus on the United States and its decision to enter the war, sort of what the debate is back home and what finally draws us into the war. Of course, we know is Pearl Harbor, so we're also going to talk about Pearl Harbor today. These are our terms, these are our to-dos, right? We want to be able to describe FDR's foreign policy in the mid-1930s, the great debate between interventionists and isolationists, how the United States became more involved in the conflict, and then explain why Japan decided to attack Pearl Harbor, describe the attack, and how did the United States mobilize for war. So Winston Churchill is going to reference the United States in many of his speeches during the crisis in France and the Battle of Britain. We heard a little bit of that the other day. The fight against Hitler, Churchill implied, was more than simply a European struggle. Nazi aggression threatened the freedoms and rights cherished by democratic nations everywhere. The contest was between ideologies as well as nations. In the United States, there are two groups. There are interventionists, people who think we should intervene in what's going on in Europe, specifically the German aggression that we see happening in Europe. And there are also isolationists. Isolationists say they are over there, we are over here. What does their conflict have to do with us? Let them resolve it. Let Britain fight its own battles. We have our own issues to deal with. Remember, we are still in the Great Depression. Really, World War II is what is going to end the Great Depression for us. We had just experienced World War I, which had cost lives. It had cost money. We were in no rush, just like the rest of the world, to engage in further conflict. You see this political cartoon here. This is Congress, right? And it says efforts to drag America into European quarrels. You see FDR pulling on Congress to try to drag them into the rest of the world. You can see they're sort of standing on a globe there. And then also the man in the back is labeled as a British diplomat. Congress does not want to get involved in foreign quarrels, but as this cartoon implies, FDR is much more willing to consider that possibility. In the buildup to World War II, the United States passes a series of neutrality acts, 1935, 1936, 1937. Sort of every time Germany does something a little bit aggressive, the United States says, hey, we are going to declare that we are neutral. In 1935, they even make it illegal for Americans to sell arms, so weapons, to any country currently at war. So if Britain declares war, we cannot sell weapons to them. Of course, that changes. In 1937, the Neutrality Act is passed in response to growing European tensions. It continues to ban the sale of arms, but requires that other goods be purchased on a cash and carry. Remember that the United States was owed a lot of money after World War I, and we want to be paid up front. That's what cash and carry means. What a lucky thing we've got separate beds in this political cartoon here. You have Uncle Sam sleeping separate from Europe, and Europe is labeled with a whole bunch of, horrible diseases. You have Stalin itch, Hitleritis, Blitzpox, Nazi fever, and fascist fever. And then at the foot of the bed underneath is the cat. It says Italian mumps. So at the top, it says the only victor. That's a bag of money, which is a common theme in American political cartoons. And it says war profits, standing over the graves of servicemen. Once safely reelected, though, President Roosevelt begins to increase his support of Britain when Britain begins to run short on funds to purchase cash and carry goods in the United States. FDR took the opportunity to address Congress. On January 6th of 1941, he spoke about the Four Freedoms. This becomes a very incredibly famous speech called the Four Freedoms speech. He says the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, the freedom from fear. that were threatened by Nazi and Japanese militarism. He believed that the best way to stay out of the conflict was to aid Britain monetarily, by sending them money, by sending them food. They're an island, they're being starved out, by sending them weapons. Of course, that's not being neutral, and that would go against the Neutrality Act. So Roosevelt's really sort of trying to turn public opinion toward helping Britain here. If you've heard of Norman Rockwell, he creates a really famous series of paintings called The Four Freedoms. This one is the freedom of speech. Save freedom of speech. FDR, remember, as we were just saying, is not a supporter of the Neutrality Acts. He's actually worried it's going to make things worse and get things to the point where the United States will be forced to intervene. FDR will actually authorize the sale of arms to China after the Manchurian invasion because there was not a formal declaration of war. So they've been invaded, but they haven't declared war. And so, despite the Neutrality Act of 1937, the United States was still allowed to sell arms to China. The Neutrality Act of 1939, though, limits arms sales. Arms sales are now allowed, but only on a cash and carry basis. So we're starting to see some loosening of restrictions here. If you see that political cartoon, if that looks like a Dr. Seuss cartoon, it's because it is. Dr. Seuss did a series of political cartoons. He believed that the United States should get involved in World War II. And you can see Uncle Sam here. I shouldn't say Uncle Sam, an old man labeled as Neutrality Acts. He's getting drug into war. It says aid that will win. Here is another really well-known, probably the most famous Dr. Seuss political cartoon of the time. You see a woman reading to children. She's wearing an America First shirt. Of the America First group, they're the ones, if you look at the bottom right, protesting against going into war. Save our sons. No convoys, no war, no death for American boys. Believing that the United States should stay out of war. So in this cartoon, she's a reference to this organization. She's reading a book to the kids called Adolf the Wolf. And the caption says, "And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it didn't really matter." And the children are looking shocked at her story. This is, of course, trying to point out to Americans how wrong he felt the American First movement was. So cash and carry means payment up front. FDR is going to propose something called destroyers for bases. Can the United States and Britain trade? If Britain gives the United States access to military bases around the world, can we send them weapons and equipment? It's not technically a cash payment, but it's still a payment. I talked a little bit about America First and the idea of the fight for freedom being pro-war, America First being anti-war. We talked about the four freedoms. We are going to do an activity on the Lend-Lease Act, or the garden hose speech, and I've got a little video I'm going to play you in just a second. The video starts out in a little bit of a crazy way, but bear with it. There is some good information here. Essentially, FDR gives a speech where he says, what would you do if your neighbor's house was on fire? Would you lend him your garden hose, or would you ask him to pay you for your garden hose, or ensure that it gets returned in perfect condition before you offer to help? And he says, our neighbor's house is on fire, and it's Britain, and Britain is burning. So brace yourselves for how weird this video starts.
I say, old chap, could we borrow a bunch of weapons? The Jerrys are at the gate, and we surely wouldn't want them crossing the Channel into Mother England. This was the situation facing the British in the early days of World War II, which prompted the signing of the Lend-Lease Act between Great Britain and the United States. Here's how it went down. England had been fighting the Nazis since 1939, and it was running out of money to pay for the munitions it had been buying from the United States. In December of 1940, England warned U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt that it'd soon be bankrupt. Though the U.S. was not yet involved in the war, President Roosevelt wanted to support England. However, he was bound by the Neutrality Act of 1939. This act allowed the U.S. to sell arms to countries like England, but only on what was called a cash and carry basis. Any closer assistance was prohibited. In early January of 1941, FDR asked Congress if he could do things a little differently. He wanted the power to lend and or lease weapons to American allies. The act would authorize the president to sell, lend, or rent military hardware to any country deemed vital to national security. This was the Lend-Lease Act, but not everybody was cool with the proposed legislation. Some Americans felt the act would give the president too much power, and there were plenty of isolationists in Congress who didn't want to get involved in that messy war over there in Europe. One of those isolationists was Ohio Senator Robert Taft, a Republican critic of many of Roosevelt's policies. Taft feared the act would, quote, give the president power to carry on a kind of undeclared war all over the world in which America would do everything except actually put soldiers in the front line trenches where the fighting is. Taft wasn't wrong. That's exactly what the Lend-Lease Act wanted to accomplish. Congress and the American public still weren't totally on board with going to war. So Lend-Lease was a compromise, a way to fight in World War II without actually fighting. Officially, the U.S. would still be neutral. The bill bounced around Congress for a couple of months before being signed that March. Though Lend-Lease was initially designed to aid Great Britain, it was also used to supply China in April of 41 and the Soviet Union in September. By the war's end, over 36 countries had received help from the U.S. to the tune of billions of dollars. The Lend-Lease Act was signed on March 11, 1941. Exactly 9 months later, Japan attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor, prompting the U.S. to officially enter World War II. Though it would provide foreign aid to its allies, any ambiguity about the Americans' role in the war was gone.
In 1941, although still not technically part of the war effort, Churchill and FDR will meet. They will formally commit to ensuring that democracy thrives and that there is peace after the war. Their goals are the promotion and safety of democracy, non-aggression, free trade, economic advancement, freedom of the seas. Also, in 1941, we see a pretty serious escalation of hostilities having to deal with German submarines, German U-boats, which could potentially have given the United States all the reason it needed to enter the war. Want to bring Japan into this conversation momentarily. Remember that Japan itself has very few resources. Japan is an island, like Britain is an island. And so that's part of its desire to expand is it also feels that it needs access to natural resources. So they have imperial ambitions in large part fueled by a desire for more resources. Britain had concentrated their naval defenses in the Atlantic, and so its eastern possessions were vulnerable, and Roosevelt will attempt to pressure Japan economically by placing embargoes on strategic materials, scrap iron, steel, oil. This will anger Japan because you remember that Japan had been an ally during the First World War, and now the United States is refusing to sell them weapons and is condemning their actions, for example, in Manchuria. This will prompt the Japanese to formally join the Axis powers. We see this continued buildup in the Pacific. FDR, as it said in that video clip, will eventually extend the Lend-Lease Act to include China and start to strengthen our military presence in the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines is still a United States possession. It will become independent after World War II. Japan will send forces to Indochina. This is Vietnam, essentially, Vietnam, Cambodia. And Roosevelt, in turn, will freeze all Japanese assets that are in U.S. held banks. And if you look at this map, the green is the Japanese Empire as of 1930. The yellow, that's where Japan invaded Manchuria. The orange, that's the Japanese invasion of China in 37. And then the purple, that's the Japanese invasion of French Indochina, which is modern day Vietnam and Cambodia. In the beginning of December 1941, the United States had engaged in warlike activity but had yet to commit itself to fighting with either side. A surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, an American naval base in Hawaii, ended all debate and brought the United States into the war. The participation of the United States in this war, as in World War I, would decide the struggle's conclusion. This is the Lend-Lease given to the British Empire and the Soviet Union from March through December of 1941, and then all the way through 1945. So you can see there how much money is given and to who. Look at that, to the Soviet Union, $20 million. The Soviet Union really had a pretty terrible economy. So Pearl Harbor, it becomes very clear that Japan is preparing for war against the United States. Japan believes that it is inevitable that the United States is going to enter the war, and so it decides that its best course of action is to choose the time and place that the United States enters the war. There is a surprise attack on Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, on December 7th of 1941. 2,403 Americans are killed. Serious damage is done to the Pacific Fleet. And at this time, FDR will ask for and receive a declaration of war against Japan on December 8th, reaffirming that the United States will fight for the four freedoms. And these are the Rockwell Four Freedom paintings that you may have seen before. Freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom of worship, and freedom from fear. All right, to be continued.